God bless you. Welcome to this podcast on the Gospels Unified. My name is Dan Stalker, and today we're going to be establishing the chronology of the Gospels. In our first podcast, we saw that one of the keys to fitting the Gospels together is chronology. That is, viewing the events of the Gospels in the order in which they happened. We also saw that if our chronology is off, there's no way we're going to have an accurate understanding of what actually happened. We'll be duped into accepting assumptions and deductions and excuses and filling in the blanks in our timeline with false causes and effects and interpolations. But we want our timeline to be correct, don't we? Because if we get that right, all four Gospels will fit together in a logical and consistent manner. Not only that, but they will fit with the prophecies concerning the Messiah and with our knowledge of history and natural history as well. So today we're examining the length of Jesus' ministry. We want an accurate timeline of his ministry. How long should it be? Most Christians assume his ministry is 3.5 years long. But that's just an assumption. The Bible never says that. But what does the Bible say? What did Jesus say? You might want to go to Luke 4. When introducing his ministry, Jesus read from Isaiah 61, and we're going to read it here in Luke 4, verse 18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. Jesus read in Isaiah that he was anointed to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. What does that mean? The phrase the year of is a figure of speech where a period of time is put for what happened during that time. In this case, a year was going to be characterized by acceptance. The word acceptable means delight, acceptance, goodwill, favor, grace. This year would be the year of acceptance. God was extending his goodwill, favor, grace to Israel in the person of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, with the idea that they would accept him. And this year would be the time for Israel to accept those riches. He didn't say acceptable years, plural. He said year, 1 year. That is what Jesus was proclaiming that day. And the clock was ticking, folks. Now look at verse 20. And he closed the book, and he gave it again to the minister, and sat down, and the eyes of all them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, This day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears. And it says he began to say unto them. He commenced teaching that this prophecy of Isaiah was being fulfilled right before their eyes. And when he said fulfilled, it meant fulfilled. There would never be another year like this one. They've been telling us for years that Christ's ministry was 3.5 years long or longer. And here he was quoted saying he only had 1 year. But how did this 3-year fallacy come about? If you read the writings of the church fathers, the leading men of the church of the first and second centuries all believed his ministry was only 1 year long. But what happened? Well, in the early 4th century, a man regarded as the historian of the early church, Eusebius, declared the Lord's ministry had to be 3.5 years long in order to fit with his understanding of a prophecy in the book of Daniel. Eusebius had a lot of influence, and in time the truth of Jesus' 1-year ministry was forgotten. And when that was lost, all logic concerning the gospel timeline seemed to have been lost with it. For example, when St. Augustine in the latter 4th century attempted to harmonize the gospel, he set Matthew as the primary source and tried to fit all the rest of the gospels with it, which was not a good choice, as it turns out. Why is that? Well, today, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered the synoptic gospels. A synopsis is when you attempt to take 3 or more works and show how they compare, keeping each work in its own column. In the last podcast, you saw some pages from the Gospels Unified, and you saw that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were each in their own column. That is a synopsis of the Gospels. A harmony of the Gospels is different. A harmony of the Gospels is when you take all the records and combine them into one narrative, like a story. They call these the synoptic Gospels because they mention many of the same incidents. The problem comes when we assume that all three are also chronological. Luke and Mark are chronological. They both follow the one-year timeline of Jesus' ministry. Luke and Mark set the timeline. There's a principle established several times in the Bible. You've probably heard of it. It is established in Moses' day and repeated afterwards, and even quoted by Paul in 2 Corinthians 13:1. In the mouth of two or three witnesses shall every word be established. That is the biblical principle that can be documented throughout the scriptures. Two or three witnesses settle a matter. So that's been true throughout the ages. Why not here? As far as the timeline of the Gospels, Luke and Mark are the two witnesses that establish the one-year timeline. That brings up another point. There's more than one reason for the four Gospels being written. They each serve several purposes. You've probably heard about Matthew depicting Jesus as the king, Mark as the servant, Luke as a man, and Jesus as the Son of God or God, depending on your theology. But that's not their only purpose. Luke and Mark also set the timeline for the four Gospels. Look at Luke 1, verse 1. For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us. Verse 3, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightst know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. We tend to couple the words in order in verse 3 and the word that in verse 4 together and think in order that, purpose. But when we do that, we're missing something. The word that in verse 4 actually means in order that all by itself. The words in order in verse 3 mean something different. They mean in order, according to the order or accession, consecutively, as in 1, 2, 3. Luke tells us right in the introduction that one purpose of his gospel is to set in order the events of Jesus Christ's ministry. Was that its only purpose? God, no. But that is one purpose, right? Luke says so. The Gospel of Mark follows the same timeline as Luke. That's why I say Luke and Mark set the timeline for the Gospel period. It takes both of them together to do this. They can do it because both Luke and Mark are, for the most part, chronological. The Gospel of Matthew is not chronological. Most assume it is because Luke and Mark are, and they report many of the same events. But Matthew wasn't written to serve as a chronology. That was not its purpose. One purpose of Matthew was, and still is, to prove to the Jews that Jesus Christ was their Messiah. Well, wait, how can you say that? Well, just read the book. Have you ever noticed the phrase that it might be fulfilled that was spoken that is while reading Matthew? It appears 9 times in Matthew, never in any other gospel. Each time it points out the prophecies and some prophecies were being fulfilled. Likewise, the phrase that which was spoken or it was spoken appear 14 times in Matthew for the same purpose, but never in any other gospel. The phrase it is written appears 9 times in Matthew. See, repetitions like that are a clue. Repetitions set the context. They show us what's important in a book or a passage. They are there to guide us in our understanding. In addition to outright saying so, the order of some of the events in Matthew were swapped around to build on this theme of Jesus being the prophesied Messiah. Through chapter 7, Matthew is chronological. After chapter 13, Matthew is chronological. But in between, there are 10 sections that must be swapped around to fit with the timeline of Luke and Mark. Once they're rearranged, guess what? They fit the same timeline. And we can see that Matthew does fit this same one-year timeline as Mark. And what a difference that makes. For one thing, it makes Matthew the worst pick for a basis of the harmony of the Gospels. But even if it's not the basis, you can also see why you might take 3 years trying to fit Matthew with Luke and Mark. It is only when you recognize that Luke and Mark set the timeline and work to fit Matthew with Luke and Mark instead of the other way around that you have an accurate timeline for Jesus Christ's ministry. And you can see that in detail in the Gospels Unified. Okay, so we've seen how Matthew, Mark, and Luke all fit this 1 year timeline. So how about John? The Gospel of John, the problem with the Gospel of John is that John shows 4 Passovers. Passover only happened once a year. So if there's 4 Passovers in John, John must have been at least 3 years long. John shows Jesus attending Passover at the beginning of his ministry when he cast the money changers out of the temple. He shows him attending Passover at the end of his ministry when he gave his life. But there's 2 other feasts which are also called Passover. One is even called the Passover, but that verse does not appear in all the text, the earliest versions of John's Gospel. The second feast is just assumed to be another Passover. But instead of focusing on the Passovers, let's step back and see the flow of major events in John. What can that tell us? And by major events, we mean the feast Jesus attended. In order to fulfill the law, Jesus had to attend all the 3 feasts that were commanded to attend by the law of Moses. This Gospel of John records each of these, plus others he attended. That is how these feasts set the framework for the Gospel of John. For instance, chapters 2 and 3 relate the Passover at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and the next day began the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was one of the 3 feasts that Jesus had to attend. These usually occurred in April. And then 50 days later, usually in June, was the second feast all men had to attend, which today is known as Pentecost. This was likely the unnamed feast in John 5 that some want to label another Passover. But then there would be no record of Jesus attending Pentecost, and that would not really fit with the rest of the Gospel of John. Recognizing this feast was actually Pentecost and not the next year's Passover, we see these 3 feasts took place in the spring and early summer. So John 3 through 5 took place in the spring and early summer. John 7 through 10 is recorded Jesus attending the next required feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, which happened in September or October. Jesus did a lot of teaching in that feast. It took 4 chapters to tell us about it. In December was the Feast of Dedication, which happened at the end of chapter 10. Those feasts occur in the fall and winter. So John 7 through 10 took place then. So we've seen John 3 through 5 took place in the spring and early summer, and chapter 7 through 10 took place in the fall and early winter. You see the flow of events? Then at the end of John 11, it mentions the next Passover was at hand, which again took place the next April. In John 12, Jesus begins his journey back to Jerusalem, where he was crucified. And the rest of John are concerned with the events of that spring. These feasts that Jesus attended set the flow of major events in John. Chapters 3 through 5 in the spring and early summer, 7 through 10 in the fall and early winter, and then chapter 12 to the end in the next spring. So what is it with these 2 additional Passovers? Do you see why many question their authenticity? Without those, all 4 Gospels concur that Jesus' ministry is only 1 year long. So why are the extra Passovers there? Honestly, I wonder if they were just added to legitimize the misunderstanding of Daniel's prophecy and to get more time to fit Matthew with the events in Mark and Luke. But they're not needed. Those extra Passovers are absolutely not needed. Not only are they not needed, they're misleading. Once those supposed Passovers are removed, all 4 Gospels fit together like a hand in a glove. This book, The Gospels Unified, proves it. There's also an appendix showing the true meaning of Daniel's prophecy, which, as it happens, also declares Jesus' ministry is 1 year long. So check it out for yourself. You can purchase The Gospels Unified on eBay or from my Substack at www.thegospelsunified.com, as well as other booksellers. Thank you for listening. And our next podcast, we will return with more goodies from the Gospels. God bless you.